Support comes from Empower Missouri, providing in-person and virtual advocacy training for a day of action to address poverty at the Capitol on February 25th. Registration at empowermissouri.org/day of action.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll talk about Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's State of the State and Budgetary address and how the Democratic chief executive made national headlines when he compared President Donald Trump's administration to Nazi Germany. We'll also talk with Ken Martin about why he decided to come to Missouri on his first national tour as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. But first, more than 2 months after the voter-approved Amendment 3 went into effect, Planned Parenthood affiliates are once again offering abortions or are about to offer abortions in the Show Me State. That's because Jackson County Judge Jerry Jung froze licensing requirements for clinics, which Planned Parenthood cited as a major obstacle for offering abortions for the first time in years. Still, there are plenty of questions about how Planned Parenthood plans to transition into the post-Amendment 3 era. There's bound to be hiccups when Missouri went from having the most restrictive abortion laws in the country to having the procedure constitutionally protected. Joining us to talk about what's happening now and what could happen in the future for abortion access in Missouri is Nick Dunne. Dunne is the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for Planned Parenthood Great Rivers, the affiliate that serves the St. Louis region. Nick, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.
The ruling last week that came out on Friday afternoon, have there been abortions performed at the St. Louis Planned Parenthood facility since that came out?
Well, first let me say that we were thrilled when Judge Young blocked this discriminatory licensing requirement, and it did allow us, or gave us a clear path to begin offering abortions again in the state of Missouri. So right now we are just waiting on approval for our complication plan from the Department of Health and Senior Services, and so once approved, we will begin offering medication abortion again in our Central West End clinic in the St. Louis area.
Can you tell us what a complication plan is?
Absolutely. It's a standard plan that we submit to the state of Missouri just to let them know what our emergency plans are in case, something happens with a patient. It's important to be prepared, and so we have submitted that plan to DHSS, and we're just awaiting approval.
There have been reports that the Kansas City Planned Parenthood Clinic performed their first abortion in years. There's been news that Columbia's clinic will resume within a couple of weeks. Have they not run into those complication plan issues that St. Louis has?
Well, so the interesting thing about the laws in the state of Missouri is that the complication plan is only needs to be submitted for medication abortion, not procedural. And so our partners over at Planned Parenthood Great Plains on the other side of the state, they have had to submit the same complication plan so they can begin offering medication abortion as well. And so we are doing that in tandem so we can provide, hopefully in the coming weeks.
Now, I know that the judge's first ruling was voluminous and dealt with a lot of different things, but wasn't the complication plan requirement struck down in that ruling, or was it not?
It was not. So Judge Young's ruling struck down many of the requirements of struck down the facility licensing requirement, but it did not strike the entire statute, and so what is remaining is the complication plan. As I said, the overall licensing requirement that the state had put in place was inherently discriminatory because it put an additional burden on abortion providers, whereas like your standard OBGYN's office would not be held to those same standards, despite the fact that they provide very similar care in terms of miscarriage care and other services.
Is there any time frame about when the Department of Health and Senior Services will approve the complication plan?
We are on their timeline, so I can't really speak to that timeline, but we are hoping that it will be as fast as possible because Missourians are waiting for access to abortion.
Is there concern, like given that we live in a state with a Republican gubernatorial administration, that they may slow walk this complication plan?
I can't speak to what their processes look like, but this is a pretty standard plan. It's been submitted before prior to our total ban in Missouri. And so we are hoping that this process will be expedited because of its similarities.
Now, you mentioned that when this plan is approved, the St. Louis Planned Parenthood Clinic will be offering medication abortions only.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is if somebody has been pregnant for more than 10 weeks, doctors would recommend a surgical abortion. So what options are available for people who fall into that category?
Yeah, so we offer medication abortion actually up to 12 weeks. We have been approved for that at our Fairview Heights Health Clinic, and so once the path has been cleared in Missouri, we plan to do that as well. But for procedural, again, we still offer that service in Fairview Heights, Illinois, and so we can support patients who need to get over there for those procedures.
Do you know when the St. Louis Clinic will be able to provide surgical abortions again?
Well, right now we are just working on getting medication abortion up and running. That is a critical step to, realizing abortion access in Missouri, with plans to scale up after that with equipment, staff training, et cetera. We will be working over the coming months to institute procedural abortion again.
Now, again, the judge's ruling came down late on a Friday,
Yep.
so I'm not sure if everybody was glued to CaseNet or our phones like we were. But I'm curious, has there been a lot of people from Missouri and elsewhere who have called into the St. Louis Clinic and have inquired about getting abortion services since that ruling?
Absolutely. So our call center staff have been fielding a higher volume of calls from people who are looking for those services, and so we're just making sure, as I said, that those folks are still able to access our Fairview Heights, Illinois healthcare facility while we wait on final approval from DHSS.
So let's talk about the licensing requirement that Judge Jung froze.
Mm-hmm.
Now that it's no longer operative, are Planned Parenthood facilities under any state-based licensing system at all?
So the decision from the judge actually put abortion providers like Planned Parenthood on equal footing with any other outpatient facility. Okay, so previously Planned Parenthood health centers were held to a much higher standard with requirements that were not even medically necessary. That included, pelvic exams for patients, even if they're seeking medication abortion, or, mandating certain widths for doorways and hallways. None of those had anything to do with patient health or safety. And so that is what is struck down. We are not held, aside from the complication plan we have to submit, we are now, as I said, on more equal footing with other outpatient facilities in the state of Missouri.
I ask because Republicans in particular who decried the ruling are now arguing that Planned Parenthood clinics don't have to follow any sort of health or safety standards. In fact, this is what Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Loughlin said about the topic earlier this week.
Last week's ruling is exactly what we warned would happen. Amendment 3 is opening the door to dangerous, unregulated abortion facilities with zero accountability. By striking down Missouri's licensing requirements, the court has prioritized the abortion industry over women's safety. These laws existed to protect women from unsafe conditions and reckless providers. Now, back alley abortions aren't just a risk, they're legal under Amendment 3.
That was Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Loughlin, a Republican from Shelbina, earlier this week. Nick, what do you make of the senator's comments there?
Well, this is just simply not true. As I said, by blocking the facility licensing requirements, we're now on equal footing with other outpatient facilities. And, we're not held to politically motivated standards at this point. We are still subject to, medical malpractice, suits just like any other physician would be. We're also held to the same standards for occupancy in our building. So, we still have standards that we have to maintain for the health and safety of our patients, but by removing this requirement, we are able to provide the health care that our patients seek and trust from Planned Parenthood.
It's interesting that you mentioned medical malpractice, because that's been another talking point from anti-Amendment 3 people, that the language in it basically shields abortion doctors from any medical malpractice suits. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, that is just not true. Doctors, physicians have to be licensed in order to, perform any sort of, medical procedure in the state of Missouri. And so by removing these facility licenses, again, we are now on more equal footing, because abortion is healthcare, and we are being held to almost the same standards as other outpatient facilities.
I know that Planned Parenthood Great Rivers had a mobile clinic last year during the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago that included medication abortions. Are there any plans to have mobile clinics throughout Missouri providing that type of service, especially if a physical clinic isn't available in a specific community?
Yeah, all options are on the table right now. We right now are just focused on getting medication abortion restarted in our St. Louis clinic, with plans to scale up both medication and procedural abortion, in the hopefully near future.
So it's a possibility that there could be mobile clinics offering medication abortions in the future.
The option is out there on the table. Like I said, we're just working on getting medication abortion started in St. Louis at our Central West End Health Clinic first.
I'm talking with Nick Dunne, the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for Planned Parenthood Great Rivers. That gets us, that last question about access beyond St. Louis gets us to a query from friend of the show, Angel of the Ozarks from Blue Sky. For the state, are there plans to expand services to other parts of the state? Springfield has a Planned Parenthood clinic. And for people down here, as well as the Boot Heel, our commute for an abortion hasn't changed much.
Yeah. So, while we are thrilled, with this ruling and that we have a clear path to restart access, this doesn't happen with just the flick of a switch. There, especially for facilities that are more in more rural areas of Missouri or Southwest Missouri, like Springfield, we have the facilities, but that's going to require training and equipment. We have an amazing staff that has been on with us for many years, who are ready and willing to provide the service. We just want to make sure that we are equipped. In the meantime, we do provide transportation assistance through our regional logistics center. So if transportation is an issue for patients, we can assist them in making sure that they can access the care that they need.
Yeah, and I think that brings to mind another reality. Since Missouri has been a state with either restrictive or non-existent abortion access for quite some time, I'm not really sure if there have been a lot of doctors trained in Missouri that could perform abortions. Is that going to be a problem when your organization does have the ability from a physical structural standpoint to expand to places like Springfield or the Boot Heel or anywhere else?
Right. Yeah. And to your point, we have been focusing much of our attention on Fairview Heights, where we are able to provide abortion care. And so it is very important that we can ensure access for people throughout Missouri. But as I said, it doesn't happen immediately. And so we are hoping that as we look to expand and look to recruit additional physicians, that will expand our capacity in order to offer it in Southwest Missouri.
Now, obviously, we're at a very early point in the resumption
Right.
of abortions in Missouri. Again, I've said this several times. This decision was less than a week ago. But I do know that Missouri will border a number of states that have either restricted or completely banned abortion. And we saw with Illinois that there was a huge influx in patients after Roe versus Wade fell. Is Planned Parenthood Great Rivers and also Planned Parenthood Great Plains expecting a similar thing to happen in Missouri in the coming months and years?
Well, you are right that in Illinois, when the total ban went into effect in Missouri, we did see a major influx of inquiries from patients, not only from Missouri, but from other banned states around the country. Especially along the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, all of those were coming to Fairview Heights in order to get the abortions that they needed. And so we do anticipate that there will be an increase or an influx of patients that are now able to come to Missouri because it's closer for them. It is too soon to tell like what that volume will look like, but we are preparing to make sure that anyone who needs that care can come to Planned Parenthood and receive it.
I mean, please be sure I'm not making this comparison to belittle the fact that like abortion is legal again. But when Missouri legalized marijuana, we saw what happened, that we became a marijuana, selling state that went above Colorado levels. I don't know if the same expectation is going to be there for abortion access because Illinois is right there and Kansas is also there.
Right.
But could you see a similar dynamic possibly happening here?
I mean, at this point, it's all still hypothetical. We're not sure, but as I said, we are preparing to welcome patients, with medication abortion, and I think we'll have a better idea of what that volume of patient interest looks like once the service gets started.
Now, last Friday's decision was in some respects an amendment to the prior December decision, and that enjoined a lot of other laws that I would like to ask you about. And one of them is what's known as like a telemedicine ban. Mm-hmm. What does that functionally mean for someone to say, have a preliminary appointment with a Planned Parenthood doctor over Zoom or Google Meet or whatever, rather than having to be physically in the clinic? Is that possible now that law has been enjoined?
So the telemedicine ban has been blocked as part of the preliminary injunction, but the in-person physician requirement is still in place. And I know that probably sounds contradictory, but we do still have the requirement in place that patients must meet in person with a physician in order to access, abortion care. But I should also note that these are temporary blocks. We are still in litigation, and so we're going to continue to fight this in the courts until patients in Missouri and anyone who comes to Missouri can access the full spectrum of care, including abortion.
If that in-person same doctor requirement was eventually struck down when this case goes into like the full trial in 2026, would it be possible for a doctor to prescribe the abortion pill to someone over Zoom or Google Meet rather than and they could take that medicine at home rather than having to go to a Planned Parenthood facility?
Yeah, so I mean, we already offer the telemedicine abortion through our Fairview Heights facility. And we use the PP Direct app, which is a resource for patients who can order their medication abortion online, go through a brief, a check-in with a physician, and then we can send those medications directly to their home so they can administer in the safety of their own home. And so we are hoping in the near future to be able to provide that care as well.
Now, predicting what appellate judges are going to do is kind of a fool's errand, but, it is expected that after this trial with Judge Jung goes into, goes to its logical conclusion next year, it's going to be appealed either way. Is there some concern that this newfound access may be temporary, either because maybe at the trial level, some of the things that have been enjoined might get unenjoined, or that the Court of Appeals or Supreme Court may not hold up what is in place right now?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't know what will happen moving forward with the litigation, but what we do know is that our patients are our first priority. They are a North Star, and we are advocating for them in the courts to ensure that they can access the care that they need. And so while we are continuing this litigation through till next year, that's going to be our main concern, is ensuring that our patients can access the care no matter what.
Now, I would be remiss if I wasn't talking about how the legislature plans to respond to Amendment 3. There's obviously the potential they may put something to repeal or replace Amendment 3 on the ballot, which I don't know what it is. It's kind of speculative. But another thing that I think House Speaker John Patterson mentioned is that could affect it more sooner than that, is that they may try to redefine what viability is via statute, and they may try to regulate abortion after viability, which in Amendment 3 is defined, and I'm paraphrasing here, please correct me if I'm wrong, is when a physician determines that a fetus could survive outside of the womb without extraordinary medical intervention. Is Planned Parenthood, Great Rivers, concerned that those two things could affect abortion care under this current legal limbo, so to speak?
Yeah, so I mean, Attempts like these are nothing new to us. We live in the state of Missouri, where a vast majority of our elected officials are, anti-abortion politicians. And so we know that they are going to stop at nothing to continue to restrict abortion access in Missouri, even in spite of what the voters supported. So I think the important thing to note here is that when anti-abortion politicians push these initiatives or these bills through, the House and Senate, it impacts patients more than anything else. It creates confusion, and sometimes patients will defer their care just because they don't know what's going on. And so, while this is going on in, the Missouri legislature, our recommendation to anyone who is confused by this is to talk to their physician, talk to their provider, and see what is the best course of action for them and for their health, and what care they are able to access at that given time.
And viability is obviously kind of a controversial thing in the pro-abortion rights community. But can you talk about and eventually, let's just say when your clinic offers surgical abortions, what would be allowed after viability if a pregnancy kind of fails in a tragic manner, basically?
Well, every pregnancy is unique, and so our trained, licensed physicians approach it that way. I think regardless of the law, it doesn't really capture the nuance that comes with, being pregnant and the many complications that may come with it. And so, our focus is on our patients and making sure they get the care that they need, that is compassionate, that, respects their privacy, and that actually addresses their needs.
Nick Dunne is the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for Planned Parenthood Great Rivers, the affiliate that serves the St. Louis region. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to be here.
When we return, we'll talk with STLPR's Will Bauer about why Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's State of the State and Budgetary address made waves beyond his home state. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. This week marked Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker's 7th State of the State and Budgetary address. And some of that speech laid bare how Illinois is facing difficult financial times that could require cuts to popular programs.
There's a whole industry of backseat bellyachers in this state and around the country who make a profession out of rhetorically tearing down Illinois and suggesting that if we would just enact one of their magic bean fixes, that we would never face another difficult budget year. But there's one thing that I've learned as governor: there are no magic bean fixes. And each year there's some difficulty that requires us to work hard to overcome it.
But to be candid, a bad budgetary situation is not unusual. In fact, Missouri is going through that right now. The clear thing that stood out in the Democratic chief executive speech was the blistering criticism of President Donald Trump and billionaire Elon Musk. Pritzker took the extraordinary step of comparing the early days of the second Trump administration to Nazi Germany.
If you think I'm overreacting and sounding the alarm too soon, consider this. It took the Nazis 1 month, 3 weeks, 2 days, 8 hours, and 40 minutes to dismantle a constitutional republic. And all I'm saying is that when the 5-alarm fire starts to burn, every good person better be ready to man a post with a bucket of water if you want to stop it from raging out of control.
So there is a lot to unpack with Pritzker's address. And who better to do the unpacking than Will Bauer, STLPR's Metro East reporter? He covered Pritzker's address with STLPR visuals editor Brian Munoz. Will, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hey, Jason.
Let's start with the budgetary part first. What did Pritzker say about Illinois' financial status in his speech?
Well, I think Pritzker and both Republicans and Democrats are gearing up for what they're describing as it's going to be a challenging year to get a balanced budget. But that's the goal, so it's going to take a little more moderation than probably the Democrats in supermajorities in both the House and Senate are maybe used to under the 6 previous years of the Pritzker administration.
Did you get a sense from the speech why the revenue situation is not as good as in years past?
So pandemic financial aid from the federal government is a big key to that. And yeah, they were projecting a $3.2 billion budget deficit in November. Now, the governor's office released a new forecast on Wednesday morning that is looking a little bit rosier, but we can get into those details later. But yeah, it's still going to be a challenging year.
Yeah, and in the clip in the introduction, Pritzker alluded to Illinois' long history with budgetary calamity. I mean, I'm an Illinois native, and I can't tell you how many people have said, is your state still bankrupt, or how broke is your state? And you know, it's gotten better. But I think the big question is, what is Pritzker planning to do to deal with the downfall in revenue?
Yeah, so this is still his biggest budget proposal ever. It's a 3% spending increase. Most areas are not going up. The exceptions would be spending on education, spending on pensions, spending on healthcare, but there are going to be some cuts that may be unpopular with some, particularly probably House Democrats. Those would be $145 million less in economic development spending, and then the one that will really and has ticked off the Latino caucus is cutting a program called Health Benefits for Immigrant Adults. It's a Medicaid-like program for some adult immigrants without legal status. That had been a long-time target of Republicans in Springfield, but yeah, it's definitely one that there's going to be some negotiating over, even though Pritzker said he'd like to get rid of it this year.
I'm not claiming to be a subject matter expert on the inner workings of the Illinois legislature, but I am a subject matter expert on the Missouri legislature, and I do know that in the last few years there have been really obvious and heated disagreements within the Republican supermajority. I have not really seen the similar dynamic where the Illinois Democrats fight amongst themselves so much they can't get much done. Is it possible that some of Pritzker's proposals with the budget here could make the Democratic reality in the legislature less harmonious than usual?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a real possibility. I think locally here, Katie Stewart, who's the now assistant majority leader of House Democrats, would say that she's been someone who's preached a little more fiscal responsibility in years prior. But for the most part, with Democratic supermajorities and good state revenues coming in, the Democrats have been able to get what they want. But yeah, this is a year where there may be some internal disagreements among the Democratic caucus, for sure.
I know you talked with some Republicans reacting to the budgetary part of his speech. Can you elaborate on what they ended up saying about Pritzker's plan to bridge the bad financial situation?
So I think some are excited to hear him say things like there's going to be no new taxes and we're going to need to be a little more moderate because, of course, they've been saying that for a long, long time. That's a pretty typical Republican stance. But I think some of them are also a little more skeptical because they were headed in thinking, there's going to be this $3.2 billion deficit, which is going to be a real problem. But then the new forecast came out from the governor's office and they're saying, what the heck? Are you just picking and choosing between forecasts that, may look a little bit better on paper?
But I read about that too. Before the speech, it was like $3.1 billion deficit. And suddenly he comes out and says, it's a balanced budget. I have the magic beans to balance the budget. What you may have already said this, but what was with the discrepancy there?
It was a new December forecast from S&P that would have said there's going to be $2 more billion in state revenue that's coming in. And then when you throw everything together, there's more money than we thought. So that's why I think some Republicans are like, well, you're just picking, the new revenue the new forecast for revenue that looks better.
We saw this with Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe's State of the State speech, but the less than robust budgetary situation tempered a lot of programmatic desires. Did you hear anything from Pritzker in terms of new things he wants to see done in the next year?
Not in terms of budget, but in terms of legislation, of course. He's got some ideas. Maybe one of the most bipartisan that drew applause from both sides of the chamber was legislation taking on PBMs, or pharmaceutical man, that's a mouthful. Pharmaceutical
it's okay.
benefit managers.
I've had some trouble today, too, but continue.
And I think people from both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, would say PBMs are the middlemen of the healthcare industry, and they're driving up everyday costs of prescription prices. So he's introduced legislation to rein in those costs. He's proposing a second round of medical debt cancellation, just like last year. Last year, he also had lots of legislation proposed around taking on the medical insurance establishment. So this proposal, the proposal this year, is banning prioritization for behavioral health care. Another popular proposal was banning cell phone use in classrooms. Other states have done that. And then 2 on education would be, he proposed a bill that would let teenagers know before they apply that they qualify for admission to state universities. And he proposed allowing community colleges to offer 4-year degrees for certain in-demand programs.
Do you find it interesting that both Republicans and Democrats at the state legislative level have joined hands in saying that we need to ban kids from using cell phones in schools? Because I've noticed that has become a remarkably popular proposal over the last couple of years.
Yes, and bipartisan support. So I suppose that is interesting, but maybe that shows there are still things that both Democrats and Republicans agree on in 2025.
I don't want my kids playing Roblox when they're supposed to be learning math. But okay, let's move on to the final part of Pritzker's speech, where he specifically compared the President of the United States administration to the rise of Nazi Germany. Here's another clip from the governor's address.
I do not invoke the specter of Nazis lightly, but I know the history intimately and have spent more time than probably anyone in this room with people who survived the Holocaust. Here's what I've learned. The root that tears apart your house's foundation begins as a seed of distrust and hate and blame.
That was Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker during this week's State of the State and Budgetary address. Will, I know we can't read the governor's mind, but why do you think Pritzker decided to use this part of the speech to talk about what's going on in national politics, especially when his address is meant to address state-level concerns?
I think anyone who's paid any kind of attention to Illinois politics in the last 6 years knows that he's about as anti-Trump as you can get. And there are definitely a number of people, both Democrats and Republicans in and around Springfield, that believe he's probably one of the Democrats that will throw their hat into the ring in 2028 for the Democratic nominee for president. And this could just be another example of him, positioning himself to make that kind of announcement, to be, one of the more anti-Trump voices. And also, I think during the Veep stakes, when Kamala Harris was trying to pick a vice presidential nominee or running mate in July, national polling showed that not many people outside of Illinois knew who Pritzker was. So when you have clips like this go viral, when you're saying something pretty provocative, that only helps, gain a more national presence, so that when he maybe does announce in 2027, more people outside of Illinois know who he is.
I understand the information economy right now is very sparse because there's so much going on, but I do want to take a step back for a moment. The Jewish governor of one of the country's largest states compared the President of the United States to the rise of Nazism. As a Jewish person myself, I listened to that and I found it extraordinary. So I'm curious how legislators responded to that, because I don't think that a Jewish politician compares the president to Nazis flippantly.
Yeah. And Democrats definitely gave a standing ovation. It came right at the end of his address, I think, like you said. And there was a standing ovation. I think there's probably, a lot of Democrats that were pretty perturbed by the last month and some change of the Trump administration and the way they've governed this country. So, yeah, that's not surprising. But other side of the aisle, Republicans were pretty much quiet and seated.
Well, I know you caught up with Representative Amy Ellick of Godfrey, who was extremely unhappy with Pritzker's remarks.
I thought it started out well and then took a very dark and disturbing turn is exactly what I thought of it. And I probably said those same words to you last year, because I do remember a shift last year. But this time, I think every Illinoisan should be really offended. He literally drew a line between people that are upset about inflation and rising government spending to Nazi Germans before World War II. And it was really disgusting, frankly.
That was Amy Ellick of Godfrey reacting to Pritzker's speech. Did other Republicans share her sentiments?
Yeah, they absolutely did. She's definitely not alone in those remarks, and it's the leader of their party, so they kind of feel like even if you don't like him, you still need to respect the office. And there were even reports that some Republicans walked out when he started drawing those lines between the Trump administration and the Nazi government.
I'm not really sure, though, if like in a state like Illinois, and I know we talked like a few months ago about how Illinois shifted rightward in the presidential race, but it's still a heavily Democratic state. And a lot of the Jewish people that I grew up with in suburban Chicago are pretty Democratic minded. So I'm not really sure if this is going to be as damaging to Pritzker as maybe Republicans want to think. That's sort of my back of the napkin analysis. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I think he comes across as a guy who's pretty calculated. So I think if he thought he was really risking something, he wouldn't do it. But this seems like a pretty calculated thing to do to maybe get some national attention and be a thorn a thorn for Trump.
Has Pritzker said he's running for a third term yet?
He is not.
He has not said that.
And I can't remember exactly when he said he would make that decision, but that's coming up here pretty quick because that'd be 2026. So I would imagine you would probably want to hear something by middle of 2025, late 2025.
Yeah, I have actually thought a little bit about this because I agree with you. Pritzker is, I would say at this point, likely to run for president in 2028 since there's no Democratic incumbent. And I think that he has to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of running as a sitting governor and being accused of neglecting his duties or foregoing a third term, potentially letting his lieutenant governor, Juliana Stratton, become governor and be one of, if not the first, black female governor in America. But then he would be running as a former elected official.
And I think there's probably more strength running as a sitting governor. Maybe you disagree with me, but I would just imagine there would have to be more strength as a sitting governor. But maybe the calculus is, depending on how this year goes fiscally for the budget, if it's going to be tough to get reelected because turns out the budget is really, really bad, maybe hard to get reelected in 2026, so it's not worth it to, be a bad sitting governor. You'd rather be a governor in good standing running in 2028.
Well, that's what happened with Chris Christie in New Jersey. By the time he decided to run for president in 2016, his approval ratings were at like 20%, and like the Bloomlet had, shriveled up by that
You wanted
point.
to do it sooner, yeah.
But, the one example of a former governor becoming president is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter wasn't actually the sitting governor of Georgia, but then you have George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, who were the sitting governors. We actually have not had a governor president in quite some time. I guess my final question, though, is Pritzker is not going to be the only person who wants to run for president in 3 years. How is he going to be able to stand out in what could be a crowded field?
I think pending the financial situation in Illinois doesn't get any worse, and he's, and maybe this proves if, this year's going to be a little more moderate, he can say, I haven't been a super duper liberal person, but he's pretty much everything he campaigned on in 2019, he got done. It was abortion, it was weed, it was infrastructure, all those things he said he was going to do, he got done. And of course, he does have Democratic supermajorities backing him up, but I think he's probably got a lot to say. A lot of things to say. I campaigned on this and we were able to get it done.
In the last 30 seconds, what else are you looking for outside of Governor Pritzker's State of the State address in your coverage of the Metro East?
Great question. We've got some interesting primaries that I don't know if we'll entirely get into, but we've got some interesting primaries over in Illinois. We've got a mayoral race in Cokia Heights and in Belleville that all should be interesting. Alton's up for re-election too. So yeah, it'll be lots of elections to look forward to, Jason.
Well, I'm looking forward to following along because I have Illinois values, even though I live in Missouri. Will Bauer is St. Louis Public Radio's Metro East reporter. Will, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jason.
When we come back, we'll talk with Democratic National Committee Chairman Ken Martin about how he plans to lead his party out of the political wilderness. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Democrats both in Missouri and nationally are in the political wilderness, trying to figure out a way to navigate Republican-dominated governments. And one of the many questions for the beleaguered party is how Democrats are supposed to appeal to voters who gravitated to President Donald Trump and other GOP candidates. Members of the Democratic National Committee recently entrusted Ken Martin with trying to figure out answers to Democrats rising out of their electoral funk. And on his first national tour since getting elected as chairman earlier this year, the longtime head of the Minnesota Democratic Party stopped in Missouri, a state that made a stark shift over the past decade toward total Republican rule. Martin spoke with me this morning at Have a Cow Cattle Company Cafe and Urban Farm Store in St. Louis. I first asked him why he decided to come to Missouri, a state that national Democrats abandoned after the 2008 election cycle as a targeted presidential state.
Well, it's an important state, and we want to make sure we're getting out to red, purple, and blue states. And Missouri is a purple state, it's heading in the right direction for our party's sake. We've got a wonderful chairman here in Russ Carnahan, and of course a strong party. And we believe that when you organize everywhere, you can win anywhere, and we want to make sure that we're here today talking with farmers, we're talking with voters throughout this tour to make sure that we're listening and really lifting up their voices. Right now there's a lot of concern with what we're seeing in Washington, D.C., and you can hear that everywhere I've been on this tour, but you can also hear amongst Democrats I've spoken to that they're ready to get themselves off the mat, get back into the fight, and make sure that we obviously stand up for people in this country who are very concerned right now with what they're seeing.
One of the reasons why Missouri isn't as competitive on a presidential level or a statewide level is Democratic collapse in rural parts of the state. Donald Trump has regularly gotten in the 80th percentile in rural counties that Democrats easily won for decades. I'm sure you experienced that in Minnesota too. What does the national party have to do to at least have a chance to get those voters to consider Democratic candidates?
Well, you have to show up. And I know that the Missouri Democratic Party has a whole plan on investing in rural counties and making sure that we're leaving no county behind. That's a big part of the reason why I ran for DNC chair. An acknowledgement, we have 3,244 counties in this country right now, and a lot of them don't have Democratic Party leadership. And so we have to just get back to basics of building organization in all parts of our country, not leaving any zip code or area behind. Look, at the end of the day, you can't turn a red area to a purple area to a blue area unless you spend some time, energy, and money there. And that's true of red states and blue states, right? What we've seen is when you don't invest in red states, they just continue to be red. You don't invest in blue areas, they start to lose vote share. And so from my perspective, we have to organize everywhere, which is the purpose of this tour, right? We were in Texas, we were in Pittsburgh, and we were in New York. We're going to be in Wisconsin. We were in Illinois. The reality is we're going to go everywhere that Americans need us to be, to lift up their voice, to organize, and then to win. And that's the role of political parties, is to win so we can actually pass public policy to improve people's lives.
I have heard a lot of Democrats who are upset right now because they feel like congressional leadership isn't doing enough to fight against Donald Trump's second presidency, but you're out of power. You don't have the House, you don't have the Senate, you don't have the presidency. And I think the big question for 2026 and 2028 is, how do Democratic officials harness this burgeoning anger you hear from Democratic voters when the GOP controls all the practical levers of power?
Well, look, I think we do see Democrats at all levels, right, actually standing up and pushing back and using the power that they have. Think about the Democratic attorney generals, right, who have been on the front lines of filing lawsuit after lawsuit, pushing back on these indiscriminate cuts and these funding freezes and the policies and executive orders that are shattering communities and impacting people's lives in such a negative way. We see our Democratic governors and local elected officials who are standing up and creating safe communities and safe spaces for the people who are being targeted by this Trump administration. And we see our members of Congress, using the power they have, which is their voice, the platforms, the power of persuasion, and getting out there and standing up and pushing back. And in fact, because of our members of Congress and the work they've done the last 2 weeks, we've seen that public sentiment has started to shift away from Donald Trump. He's already lost points on his approval rating. People are already souring on Donald Trump because he's not focusing on things right now that will actually help improve their lives. He said on day one he was going to bring down the cost of goods and the cost of living for people in this country. He hasn't done anything. He hasn't focused one modicum amount of energy or action on actually doing that. He has focused on everything but at improving people's lives. That is a really important piece right now. Now, Democrats at every single level have stood up, not just to resist Trump for resistance sake, but to lift up the voices of people in this country who are deeply frustrated by the lack of action by this administration.
Now, going back to my question about rural Missouri changing, I've heard a lot of theories about why it has shifted. And one that I've heard in 2022 while I was traveling in Northeast Missouri is that the GOP has a very powerful presence on social media platforms like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. They have Fox News, they have Newsmax, they have OANN and other television networks that people there watch constantly. How do Democrats counteract that media environment that has become so prevalent in places that have become more red over the past few years?
Well, first off, we need to acknowledge that the Republicans have created an amazing ecosystem, media ecosystem, information ecosystem, and we need to do the same thing. But we also need to make sure that we are showing up on all these platforms, in all these online spaces. You see, one of the things we know is that 90% of Americans have a smartphone, and they're getting information all the time. And we got to get out of this idea that we should only communicate with voters in an election year. People are getting information all the time because they have a smartphone, and we need to understand that they're getting their information from non-traditional information spaces, right? Not from media outlets, from podcasts, from social media, as you mentioned, from any online community, and we have to do a better job of making sure we're there and present and communicating on those platforms as well.
My last question for you, you talk about a lack of infrastructure, and I hear that all the time in Missouri. Their county parties, for instance, maybe don't have the money or the people or the know-how to build enough momentum to win a state legislative or a county election. But how realistic is it to expect the DNC is going to pour a lot of resources into places like Missouri when we're not competitive on a presidential level, we don't have a governor's race or a Senate race this year? How realistic is it to expect like real tangible help to help build that infrastructure?
Realistic. And the reason why is because we can't be a party just focused on 7 battleground states. We can't be a party just focused on a few congressional seats. If we're going to turn a red state to a blue state, we've got to spend time, energy, and money, right? And that's why when I was the president of our state party association, we negotiated out historic investments into all of our 50 states and 7 territories, right? And we're going to continue to do that. We're going to expand on that and do even more. Because as I said when I ran for this position, we need to get the DNC out of D.C. We need to focus on building the infrastructure in states like Missouri, right? We know we've got a wonderful party operation here, and we need to support that because, let me use a hockey analogy for a second. I have to because I'm from Minnesota, right? Wayne Gretzky said you have to skate to where the puck will be, not where the puck is. We see the trend lines here in Missouri. We know we can win. I remember when I went to school at the University of Kansas, I remember coming over to Missouri when it was a purple state. It still is a purple state. And you know what? We can get back to being a blue state. But it's not going to happen unless you spend some time, energy, and money. The DNC has to get out of that D.C. beltway. They have to come to states like Missouri and see the work that's going on the ground. I'm really excited about what I've seen already. I've been here, as Russ knows, a number of times over the last few years, and I'll continue to come back, and we'll do our part to invest here because we're going to organize everywhere. Through the lens of when you organize everywhere, you can win anywhere. That is absolutely true. I've seen it in places throughout this country.
Russ and I, who are both Missouri Tigers, will not hold your Jayhawker against you.
I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be booted out of this cafe. But you know, I spent a lot of time in Columbia. Did you ever go to the Blue Note?
Oh, of course I did. I lived in. Russ and I got to know each other because I worked at the Columbia Daily Tribune, so I know the Mid-Missouri well. But Thank you very much for your time.
So when I came up in the early
Sorry.
90s when I was at KU, I went to Columbia a lot because of the Blue Note, and I saw Pearl Jam there. A very small concert at the Blue Note. So
Well, I saw Third Eye Blind there when I was in school.
There you go.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
That was Democratic National Committee Chairman Ken Martin talking with me earlier this morning at the Have a Cow Cattle Company Cafe and Urban Farm Store in St. Louis.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.